Hello everybody, welcome back to Gaming History. Today we're going to be talking about the history of key games, a long forgotten subdivision of Atari from their earliest days. Key Games was founded all the way back in 1973 by a man known as Joe Keane. He was a friend and neighbor of Atari co-founder Nolan Bushnell. At the time, Atari had a problem with pinball and arcade distributors who wanted exclusivity deals. So, Nolan Bushnell came up with a way to get around that. He had the Key Games created for them so they can make clones of their pre-existing games and sell them off to other companies to have them distribute them to get around the exclusivity deals. And so Joe Keane was set to be the leader of Key Games. And from October of 1973 to July of 1974, they exclusively produced remakes and knockoffs of Atari's games. Such games included their first one, Elimination, a knockoff of Quadra-Pong, a sequel to Pong, and Spike, a remake of Atari's Rebound. Now, this all changed in November of 1974 when Key Games decided to start making their own video games, with the first original game they decided to make being a game called Tank, which was massively popular. Now, prior to this, in September of 1974, Atari had actually merged Key Games into Atari, though they decided to keep them as a separate division. Now, the reason why they did this was due to financial and management issues that were taking place at the company, but the massive success of Tank allowed them to bounce back from these financial issues they're facing at the time. Due to the success of this, Key Games continued to produce their own original games. Now, early on in the game's history, to the public, Key Games advertised themselves as a completely separate entity to Atari and as a competitor and rival to them. And they also claimed that they hired defectors from Atari, though this wasn't true, as when Key Games was founded, in actuality, Nolan Bushnell sent several programmers and members of Atari to go work at Key Games. So the claim that they hired defectors wasn't really true, but it was just part of the ploy in their early days to pretend that they were a completely different company from Atari, when really they just sent some people over to Key Games. Now, Key Games continued to produce original games, even producing several sequels to their massively popular game Tank, until 1978, when they were shut down by Warner Communications. Warner Communications had purchased Atari back in 1976, and 2 years later, in 1978, had decided it was time to shut down Key Games. The last game that Key Games had produced was the game Ultra Tank, which was released in February of 1978, meant to be the third sequel to Tank. Now, the Tank games would live on, as the packing game for the original Atari video computer system was a game called Combat, very, very clearly based off of Tank. As if you look at Combat and you look at Tank, and there are sequels to Tank, they're very, very, very similar to each other. And this was a packing game for the Atari 2600 for several years, up until it was replaced up until several years later when it was replaced. But clearly, Tank had had at least some kind of influence on Atari, past them just allowing them to bounce back from their initial financial strain, as they probably took some inspiration for Combat from Tank. Look at the two, very similar. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that's all I got to say for today's episode. Merry Christmas to all, and to all a good night. It's Christmas Eve right now. I think Santa's coming soon. So I'll see you around. I gotta go set out the milk and cookies for old fat boy when he comes around. So I'll see you around. All right now. Bye. Have a nice time.